Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kara Hendrickson, Executive Director of BPI. On behalf of the Free to Move Coalition and BPI, I would like to welcome you to the first of a two-part webinar series on traffic stops. BPI is an independent public interest law and policy center where we address compelling racial and social justice issues that impact the Chicago region and the state of Illinois. Through our advocacy, we work to drive racial, social, and economic justice through a focus on police accountability, reform of the criminal legal system, and housing and community development. BPI has worked for years to enact systemic police reforms, including by strengthening the police accountability system, promoting community safety, improving police practices, and reimagining the roles that police departments and other entities play in producing public safety. As part of our Reimagining Public Safety work, we are a proud member of the newly formed Free to Move Coalition, which is working together to envision a more equitable traffic safety system in Chicago. One of our Free to Move partners, Larry Dean from the Community Renewal Society, will introduce the coalition a bit later. Today's webinar will focus on the pervasive and inequitable use of traffic stops in Chicago. Traffic stops are the most common interaction that most Americans have with the police. For many Black and Latina drivers, traffic stops are even more common and the risks even more severe. The deaths of Tyree Nichols, of Sandra Bland, of Dante Wright, and of others following traffic stops require nothing less than an honest review of this practice. To examine traffic stops in Chicago, we'll hear from a number of distinguished panelists today. Before turning to our panel, you'll first hear from Amy Thompson, staff counsel at BPI, who will paint a picture using data of how much, where, and who is targeted by traffic stops in our city. Over the last year, BPI has conducted extensive data collection and analysis to better and more fully understand the scope, purpose, and impact of the Chicago Police Department's use of traffic stops. I'd like to thank the faculty and students at the University of Chicago Data Science Institute for helping us to conduct that data analysis. Following this data presentation, we'll turn to a conversation with our panelists, and we'll conclude with how you can learn more or get engaged with the Free to Move Coalition. Before I turn things over, two housekeeping matters. First, please note that we are recording this webinar so that it may be made available to those who aren't able to attend. Also, we'll hold some time at the end for questions from our audience. Feel free at any time in today's presentation to add your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address as many of those as we can. And now to Amy Thompson for a data presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Kara mentioned, my name is Amy Thompson, and I am staff counsel at BPI. Traffic stops are the most common interaction Americans have with law enforcement. For drivers of color, this police contact happens much more often compared to their fellow white motorists, and it's led to some of the most tragic instances of police violence committed against Black people in this country. Drivers in Chicago have seen a staggering increase in traffic stops in recent years, which has left people in the city with concerns about the practice and its disproportionate impact on the city's Black and Latina residents. Last year, BPI began collecting and analyzing data for the Free to Move Coalition to try to understand how and why traffic stops have become so commonplace in the city. Our analysis led us to some key findings. First, Chicago Police Department traffic stops have dramatically increased in recent years, increasing 700% after 2015. Second, CPD isn't making traffic stops to make traffic safer. Instead, police are making large numbers of stops for minor traffic offenses to fish for evidence of criminal activity. Third, the stops are an ineffective tool to meet CPD's purported goal of crime investigation. For the hundreds of thousands of traffic stops performed each year, this strategy leads to low rates of citation, contraband recovery, and arrest. Fourth, and most importantly, the stops are harmful and they're racially disparate. CPD's traffic stops disproportionately impact Black and Latine drivers and communities on Chicago's south and west sides. Black and Latine drivers are more likely to be stopped, searched, subjected to uses of force, and arrested when compared to white drivers. Before we turn to our panelists, I'll walk through the data that supports these findings. We'll begin with a look at the increase in traffic stop numbers and the reasons these stops are being made. Next, we'll review evidence about what law enforcement objectives CPD is meeting with these stops. And finally, we'll focus on how these stops are disparately impacting Black and Latine drivers and communities. Throughout the presentation, I'll be reviewing quite a few numbers and graphics. All the data and figures reviewed in this presentation and more can be found in BPI and the Free to Move Coalition's new report, A New Vehicle for Stop and Frisk, the Scope, Impact, and Inequities of Traffic Stops in Chicago. We reviewed data from over 4 million traffic stops conducted by CPD over 18 years, with a particular focus on stops from 2015 to 2021 when traffic stops increased. The data is from publicly available sources and Freedom of Information Act responses from the Chicago Police Department, the Illinois Department of Transportation, the Illinois Secretary of State, and the City of Chicago Office of Inspector General. I'll note that during our review, we found some discrepancies across data sources that raised questions about the accuracy and the completeness of CPD's traffic stop data collection and reporting. To account for these discrepancies, we relied on the CPD data sets that showed the lowest numbers of stops and the highest rates of contraband recovery to ensure we were viewing the stops in the light most favorable to CPD. But despite these potential inconsistencies, the available data allowed us to examine trends across millions of traffic stops. It ultimately presents a staggering picture of racially disparate, excessive, and ineffective traffic stops in Chicago. Let's turn to the data. What first became clear in our analysis was that traffic stops in Chicago skyrocketed in recent years. In 2004, when police departments were first required to report traffic stops to the Illinois Department of Transportation, CPD conducted around 240,000 stops. Over the next 11 years, this number slowly dropped down, reaching a low of around 86,000 stops in 2015. After 2015, stop numbers shot up, increasing by 700% in 4 years. They reached their peak of almost 600,000 traffic stops in 2019. Although numbers in 2020 dropped, likely due to the COVID-19 pandemic, stop numbers rebounded and are on their way back up. We next observed that the types of violations CPD was pulling people over for were increasingly shifting towards stops for minor offenses, rather than those that could present more serious traffic dangers. In 2004, over 75% of stops made by CPD were for moving offenses. These offenses, which regulate how a person can move their vehicle, including speed and running through a stop sign. These offenses are the types of offenses most likely to be more dangerous driving behavior. Yet since stops began increasing in 2015, CPD began to focus more on making stops for equipment violations. By 2020, equipment violations took the lead as the largest category of traffic stops made by CPD. Equipment violations include having a broken taillight, a cracked windshield, or an object hanging from your mirror. Sometimes these can present real safety risks, but as a general matter, they tend not to be so serious that they require an immediate law enforcement response. The focus on minor offenses becomes more apparent when looking at the specific traffic violations that CPD listed as the initial basis for stops. From 2019 to 2021, 2 categories of offenses, having an unlit or broken headlight or taillight, and failure to have valid or properly displayed registration plates or tags, were the initial reason an officer made over 50% of traffic stops. CPD made stops for more dangerous offenses like speeding, reckless driving, and DUI much more rarely. Speeding comprised only 1.7% of the stops, and reckless driving or DUI comprised 0.19% of stops. So why did traffic stop numbers shift so drastically in such a short period? And why for such minor offenses? One theory that's supported by CPD's own data is that the increase reflected a change in CPD criminal investigation strategy. In 2015, CPD entered into a settlement agreement with the ACLU in response to the ACLU's findings that CPD disproportionately stopped and frisked Black people, often for reasons that didn't even amount to reasonable suspicion. This resulted in a significant reduction in CPD's stop and frisk practices over the next few years. At the same time, CPD's traffic stop numbers shot up. It appears as if, instead of stopping people using investigatory stops premised on reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, CPD pivoted to using traffic stops, which would allow them to still stop motorists so long as the driver made some traffic violation, no matter how small. Then they could use that stop to fish for other signs of criminal activity, even if they had no suspicion in the first place. This is called a pretextual stop. CPD leadership has made statements that confirm this conclusion by claiming that they increase traffic enforcement in response to violent crime. But for all these stops, seemingly intended to detect criminal activity, the data shows these stops rarely lead to citations, contraband recovery, or arrests. In 2021, only 4.26% of traffic stops resulted in a citation. That's far below the rates of some other cities. Put in perspective, Aurora and Joliet, the next two largest cities in Illinois, had a 25% and a 79% citation rate, respectively. In other large cities with large police departments, the citation rate is also high, with New York City citing drivers in 77% of stops in 2022, and Houston citing drivers in 52% of stops in 2021. As a result of the hundreds of thousands of stops, CPD recovered relatively little contraband. In 2021, less than 1% of traffic stops resulted in recovery of illegal items like drugs, alcohol, or weapons. About 0.5% of stops reported inventory drugs or drug paraphernalia. When looking at the firearm data, we see only a small fraction of traffic stops leading to police recovering firearms. CPD records show that around 1,500 firearms were inventoried in 2019, 2,200 in 2020, and 2,600 in 2021 during an arrest for at least one traffic-related charge. This translates to 0.26% of stops in 2019, 0.67% of stops in 2020, and 0.7% of stops in 2021, leading to firearm recoveries. The data also shows that as stops have increased, the percentage of traffic stops resulting in an arrest has decreased. In 2016, around 9% of stops resulted in an arrest. From 2018 to 2020, arrests occurred in around 3% of traffic stops. In 2021, only 2.25% of traffic stops resulted in an arrest. The relatively infrequent contraband recovery and arrests generated by such massive numbers of traffic stops raises serious doubts as to the efficacy of CPD's law enforcement tactic. But beyond being ineffective, CPD traffic stops raise serious concerns because they disproportionately harm Black and Latine drivers and communities. The map on the left shows the racial distribution of Chicago's estimated driving population. White Chicagoans live mostly on the north side of the city, Black Chicagoans tend to live mostly on the west and south sides, and Latine Chicagoans live mainly in the northwest and southwest sides of Chicago. This map on the right shows the average yearly numbers of traffic stops from 2015 to 2021 per 100 drivers by police beat. The darker the color, the greater the concentration of stops. When you compare the population distribution by race map on the left with the map of stops on the right, you can see stops are significantly concentrated on Chicago's south and west side neighborhoods, which are predominantly Black and Latine. When we compare the stop rates of the estimated white driving population to the stop rates of the estimated Black and Latine driving populations, the disparities persisted. These maps show those disparities by police district, with the darker orange colors indicating a greater likelihood of getting stopped as compared to white drivers. Citywide, from 2015 to 2021, the average Black driver was 6 times more likely to be stopped than the average white driver. Looking at individual police districts, Black drivers were at least twice as likely to be stopped in over 72% of police districts as compared to white drivers. In some police districts in majority white areas, Black drivers were 6 to 10 times as likely to be stopped compared to white drivers. Citywide, Latine drivers were stopped 2 times the rate of white drivers, Looking at individual police districts, Latine drivers were more likely to be stopped than white drivers in about 73% of districts from 2015 to 2021. This disparity for Latine drivers was the largest in police districts in the downtown area and the near north side. But it's not just stops that are targeted at Black and Latine drivers. The police actions that can stem from a stop also showed evidence of racial bias. This graphic compares the racial breakdown of the estimated driving population with the proportions of stopped and searched drivers. White drivers were both understopped and undersearched relative to their share of the driving population. Black drivers, however, were both overstopped and oversearched. Black drivers made up 28% of the estimated driving population, but were involved in 61% of all traffic stops and 65% of all searches. We also see racial disparities when focusing in on consent searches. A consent search occurs when an officer receives consent from a stopped person to search their person and/or their vehicle. Officers don't need to have any level of suspicion of criminal activity before requesting a driver's consent to search. But these searches are problematic. Not only do they allow police to embark on suspicionless fishing expeditions of a person and their belongings, but the coercive nature of a police encounter means any consent given may not be truly voluntary. From 2015 to 2021, the percentage of stopped Black drivers who were asked by officers for consent to search their vehicle was over 4 times the percentage of stopped white drivers. The percentage of stopped Latine drivers asked to consent to search their vehicle was over 3 times the percentage of stopped white drivers. Several consequences can flow from a traffic stop, from civil fines and criminal legal system involvement to psychological and physical harm. There too, we see racial disparities across who is impacted most. First, let's review traffic citation numbers. In 2021, although only 4.25% of stops resulted in citations, Black drivers made up about 65% and Latine drivers comprised almost 20% of these citations. White drivers received only a little over 13% of the citations issued in 2021. Although that's slightly higher than the rate at which they're stopped, it still represents a small portion of the citations given. Turning to arrests, in 2021, although 2.25% of stops resulted in arrests, 72% of people arrested from traffic stops were Black and 21% were Latine. Only 5% of people arrested from traffic stops that year were white. More severe harms can also come from a traffic stop. Traffic stops too often escalate into violence, and there too, Black and Latine people experience the brunt of the impact. From 2018 to 2021, CPD conducted 1,012 uses of force during a traffic stop. In almost every instance, this force was used against Black or Latine people. Over 96% of traffic stop uses of force were against Black or Latine people. The striking concentration of uses of force at traffic stops is alarming. The data described here shows compelling evidence that CPD has substantially increased its use of traffic stops as a policing strategy, that these stops are mostly for minor offenses intended to fish for criminal activity rather than to promote traffic safety, that the citation, contraband recovery, and arrest rates show that these stops are an ineffective approach at reaching CPD's goals of crime detection. And most importantly, that Black and Latine drivers and communities are disproportionately experiencing the harmful weight of this ineffective policing strategy. To read more about the data discussed here in greater detail, visit www.freetomove.shy.org. But the data only tells part of the story. To delve further into the impacts of traffic stops in Chicago, I'll hand it off to my fellow Free to Move Coalition member, Larry Dean, who will introduce today's panel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Larry. I am the Policy and Organizing Associate for Community Renewal Society. Community Renewal Society is an organization that works with churches and congregations on a number of social justice initiatives and legislative processes, such as criminal justice, economic justice, police accountability, and LGBTQIA issues. I'm gonna check briefly if my sound is on. Okay, it is, just making sure. We are on the steering committee of the Free to Move Coalition. The Freedom Move Coalition is an alliance of community and advocacy organizations working to create a safer, more racially equitable system of traffic safety in Chicago that works for everyone, especially those who have been most impacted by discriminatory police enforcement. To further the coalition's work, Freedom Move and BPI designed this webinar to invite folks across Chicago to come together and discuss the problems with the way Chicago performs traffic stops. Today's event will feature a discussion among our moderator and panelists who each have unique insights into the experience with traffic stops in Chicago. First, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Tobara Richardson. Tobara Richardson has served as Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety for the City of Chicago, Inspector General since October 2022. Before joining the OIG, Richardson served as counsel to the Illinois Attorney General on social justice and equity. She also worked as an assistant United States attorney in the Northern District of Illinois and as an assistant state's attorney in Cook County. Across her experiences, Richardson has led project teams addressing policy matters, worked closely with law enforcement agency, and engaged directly with stakeholders in Chicago's communities. Outside of serving the city of Chicago, Richardson enjoys volunteering at Holy Sanctuary Community Church and training other attorneys and law students locally, nationally, and internationally. Richardson earned her JD and a BA in English Language and Literature from the University of Chicago. Next, our panelist is Jose Manuel Almanza. Jose is the Director of Advocacy and Movement Building at Equiticity and Freedom Move Coalition Coordinator. Jose Manuel was born and raised in the Little Village neighborhood in Chicago. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps as an aviation supply specialist in 2008, after which he resumed his educational career, earning a BA in political science and a master's in public administration from Roosevelt University. That is where he began organizing students and co-founded the Young Democratic Socialists of America chapter at Roosevelt in 2016. The COVID-19 pandemic reactivated Jose Manuel, and he began organizing against gentrification and over-policing in Little Village. As a transit organizer, he led the Transit for All campaign that created Chicago's very first citywide transit riders union, fighting for a reliable and equitable public transit system. Dedicated to liberation and social justice, Jose Manuel leads Equiticity's advocacy efforts by bringing people together to build the collective power needed to create change. Our next panelist is Sharone R. Mitchell Jr. Sharone Mitchell Jr. is a Cook County public defender, serving a 6-year term that began on April 1st, 2021. The Cook County Public Defenders is one of the largest unified public defender offices in the nation, with nearly 700 employees, a budget of approximately $80 million, and 23 divisions and units. In 2016, Mitchell joined the Illinois Justice Project, a policy reform organization dedicated to supporting people, programs, and policies that can reduce inappropriate incarceration, improve community safety outcomes, and increase justice in the legal system. Mitchell became director of the Illinois Justice Project in 2019 and solidified its reputation as one of the state's leading criminal justice reform nonprofits. Mitchell has a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a law degree from DePaul University. A lifelong resident of Chicago, he grew up and resides on the south side of Chicago. The third panelist is Pascal Sabino. Pascal Sabino is a journalist with Block Club Chicago, whose work has focused on systemic issues facing Black Chicagoans on the West Side. His award-winning investigation into Chicago police traffic enforcement used public records and data to document how Black Chicagoans living on the South and West Sides have overwhelmingly been affected by the surge in police encounters. As a collaborator on the circuit, a data-driven project dedicated to unearthing inequalities in the justice system, Pascal is investigating the use of traffic stops as a strategy by Chicago police to target illegal gun possession. Our final panelist is Remel Terry. Remel is a commissioner on Chicago's Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability. Remel is a community leader and advocate proudly from Chicago's West Side. She has dedicated her life's work to advancement of the Black community and its youth. Remel's commitment to eradicating racial disparities is a direct result of her upbringing and tightly knit village. From an early age, she immersed herself into community sustainability efforts and has worked with groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, the Anti-Defamation League, and Black Lives Matter on issues related to social justice, police misconduct, and accountability. Remel has partnered with various grassroots organizations to address issues of inequity in legislation and enforcement, economic advancement, education, American legal systems reform, health, affordable housing, and political action. Today, Remel serves as the first vice president of the Political Action Committee chair for the Chicago West Side branch of the NAACP, the parent coordinator for 360 Nation, and the civic leader with the Business Leadership Council. And most recently, she was appointed as the interim commissioner from the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability. Remel is also former vice chair for the Make-A-Wish Foundation's Targeted Community Engagement Council, a former advisory council member of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, COPA, and previously served on the Good Government Transition Committee for Mayor Lori Lightfoot's administration. Remel received her BS, Bachelor's of Science, from Lewis University in Aviation Administration with a minor in business. I will now hand it over to Tobara to start the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Welcome all to this panel on the problem with traffic stops in Chicago. My name is Tobara Richardson, and I serve as the Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety for the City of Chicago, Office of Inspector General. I will be moderating this panel for you all today. As you've been previously told, this panel is sponsored by BPI and free to move accordingly. Anything I say should not necessarily be or is not necessarily the opinion of the Office of Inspector General. So I just wanted to put that out there. And as the earlier presentation given by Amy described, traffic stops create a common interaction between people and law enforcement. And Chicago has seen an increase in the number of traffic stops. And that increase has happened even since the pandemic has ended. As Amy said, we saw a dramatic increase in 2015, and of course, COVID had its effect, but now we see an increase again. So the data also shows that there are reasons to be concerned about the negative and racially disparate impacts that these stops are having, as well as questions relating to the stop's effectiveness. These are all questions we will delve into with our panelists today. If you have questions throughout the panel, please feel free to add them to the question and answer feature. And those questions, or a few of them at least, we will try to get to at the end of the discussion. So with that, let's get started. My first question is going to be directed to Jose and Remel. Amy just set out lots of data about traffic stops, including that is now one of the most common interaction that Chicagoans have with the police. And we also know that everyone has a different experience when they are stopped by the police. And that experience is not the same for everyone. And in addition, additionally, these stops can be deeply impactful and some life-changing. So for each of you, Jose and Remel, how would you describe the impact of traffic stops? And also, if you will address how traffic stops or these types of stops concentrated policing impacts each of your communities respectively. Two-part question. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tobara. I can go ahead and answer first. I would say just from personal experience, and then also being out there talking to community members, neighbors, I noticed a common theme is that we literally get a physiological response simply by seeing a police officer in a rearview mirror, or simply seeing a squad car pass by. And this is, while we're just, me, my personal experience, just, driving to school, walking to the corner store, so things like that are where, we're not having any bad intentions. We're not having anything, and we're not doing anything bad. We're just minding our own business, going about, and we keep getting, pulled over or stopped and frisked. And just to have that physiological response just to seeing a police officer just tells us that there's just this generational trauma that has been instilled in us, that it kind of goes on to the second question. So what kind of impact it has on our communities. As the data shows that, we get pulled over the most and we get stopped and frisked the most. However, they don't find there's no citations, very little contraband is being found. All this leads to the sense of distrust between community members and policing, because there is a common sense that we're just being harassed. And I think that's what the data shows, that we are receiving the brunt of this new strategy. However, they're not finding anything. So at the end of the day, people get pulled over, people get asked these questions, people get gun pointed at them, but nothing results of it. So that just further deteriorates the trust between police and communities. And we can never move forward with this kind of strategy in place. So that's why the work that the Free to Move Coalition is doing is very important nowadays.
Yes, so I would like to echo some of the sentiments shared by Jose. The impact of a traffic stop is unfortunately more often than not seen as a negative occurrence, right? It can also be traumatizing to those of us that reside in these predominantly Black communities. Too often we are unsure of the why behind the traffic stop. And with the pervasive PTSD that exists within Black people in this country, traffic stops can also be very triggering. And so this feeds into the overall impact on communities. It becomes just another obstacle that we face. And for some, it creates a sense of hopelessness when you see that those who look like you are being pulled over. And I personally, and I'm sure other believers, we sometimes will say a prayer that traffic stop, that we're witnessing concludes without escalation nor harm to any of those parties that may be involved.
Also, if I could add on just one more thing that Remel kind of reminded me. Another way that these types of stops have, impacted communities, I've seen now lately, there's someone's getting pulled over, and then I'll see another car, either next to or a little bit further ahead, just pulled over, watching the situation happening, making sure that it doesn't escalate further, or just being there to document in case something does happen. And that's something that I don't remember seeing earlier growing up, and that's something that I've noticed now, that it's kind of how communities have been responding to these situations.
Thanks to both of you for that. We're going to shift gears a little and move from more so of like that qualitative data that you all have just given us from your communities to a legal framework. So I'm going to direct this next question to Sharone. Specifically, I want to ask if you will tell us a bit about the legal framework of our traffic stop system. What might a typical traffic stop look like? What are the legal justifications for conducting traffic stops?
Yeah, it typically looks like this. And first, before I start, thank you so much for having me here today on behalf of the public defenders of Cook County. It looks like this. A traffic stop will often be, a stop that is based upon an alleged observation, oftentimes alleged observation of a violation of the traffic code. Sometimes it's one car, sometimes it's multiple cars that law enforcement will stop a car with. That observation of a violation of the traffic code can give police a reason to conduct said stop. Now, we see kind of thousands of stops as our attorneys are often dealing with these cases. And the videos that we reviewed really justify that shift in policy that Attorney Thompson laid out, moving from kind of stopping people on the street to stopping people in cars. We also know that the kind of goal remains the same, and oftentimes it is to engage in a search after that stop. However, we know that just observing a traffic a violation of the traffic code does not justify an actual search. So what we often see is law enforcement kind of searching for a reason to justify that search, either through a statement, like asking questions that would justify that search, or observing something, or asking for the right to justify that search. And I think that one of the things that's important to note as I conclude is that oftentimes these stops don't happen because someone made a call, right? Oftentimes we think, oh, there was a call of a person in a red car who had a gun. That's not what happens. Typically, it is really random. It's really only the race of the driver and the location of that driver that leads to these searches and leads to these stops. So that's how it kind of looks legally, where it is the observation of, or alleged observation of, a violation of the traffic code, and then something else that the officer sees that would justify their ability to get in the car and search. And sometimes they just don't get it. So the Fourth Amendment goes out of the window and they just conduct the search anyway.
Okay, just to piggyback, Sharone. So first thing, let me go back. When I say Amy, I'm using first names to make this a more like relaxed and conversational panel. But when Sharone said Attorney Thompson, when he says Attorney Thompson, when I say Amy, same person who gave us the data. So that's the first thing. But then I want to go back to the last part of something you said. So you mentioned that based on your perspective, a lot of times the stops that you have seen through your office are based off of race, based off of location. Will you tell us what a pretextual stop is, whether pretextual stops are illegal, and if they are not illegal, why is that an issue?
Yeah, a pretextual stop is when a police officer stops the vehicle with the express intent to conduct a criminal investigation that's unrelated to the violation of the traffic code. So let me try to put that in English. They're not stopping you because your taillight was out. They're stopping you because they think you did something else, or they want to conduct a search to get into your vehicle. So it's not about the traffic, it's about something else. Now, the reality of the situation is that those pretextual stops are not legal. And if they can prove, if they can say that, hey, we saw the person violate the traffic code, and that would justify the stop, even if it's pretextual. So those stops are legal as long as they can, as long as when I say they, law enforcement can justify some violation of the traffic code or some suspicion that you broke the law sometime in the past.
Thanks for giving us that context. We are going to pivot again. And so next we're going to go back into the data. And I want to direct this next question to Pascal. In recent years, you have spent time investigating how traffic stops in Chicago have increased and changed. How are these changes impacting different people across Chicago, specifically by race, by neighborhood, or other characteristics?
Thank you so much, Tobara. So I think it's really important to note that the number of traffic stops that Chicago police, it's increased at an alarming rate, as Amy pointed out earlier, but we have to note Chicago police are also vastly underreporting these stops, which is really important because that means that police are having interactions, encounters, potentially volatile encounters, as we described earlier, but they're not documenting those encounters in a way that our laws that require them to document, which the goal of those laws is for accountability. So we know what our police department is doing. They're not following those laws and documenting those. And so there's a degree to which we don't necessarily know how they're engaging with members of the public, which there's a piece of that's kind of frightening. But from the data that we do have, we can see that the growth of traffic stops has been vastly uneven. So prior to 2015, traffic stops, they happened fairly evenly around the city, fairly equal traffic enforcement, whether you're in Lakeview, Woodline, South Side, West Side, North Side, wherever. But in recent years, there have been many, many times more stops in some neighborhoods compared to others. If you were to guess where these traffic stops are mostly happening, obviously it's the South and the West Side, which is Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. And so I think about this as kind of a remapping of where Chicago police is enforcing traffic laws and where they're not. The data that Chicago police does report, it makes it very clear that they're stopping Black drivers many times more than other drivers. And so to an extent, it's a geographic issue. It's happening in huge volumes in some neighborhoods, and we're not really seeing that as much in other neighborhoods. So a interesting thing on this, I think, is that the for me, the biggest predictor of where Chicago police is conducting traffic stops is where were they doing stop and frisk. If you mapped out where Chicago police was conducting foot stops under, the stop and frisk policy that I think was highly controversial due to the potential for violations of civil and constitutional rights. It's almost like a perfect substitute. Where they're conducting traffic stops now is where they used to do stop and frisk. And so I think of it as kind of a new tactic to accomplish the same thing.
Thanks for that. And so we're going to switch gears again. And you may be wondering, well, why is she going back and forth? She's going between data and she's going between the qualitative questions. And it's because at the end of the day, there's no way we can get a full picture, really understand what's going on if we have one without the other. So we're going to need the data and we're going to need the unique perspectives of folks who are actually being impacted by traffic stops in Chicago. And so that's why we are doing a great job of going back and forth between hearing the data. So we heard the data initially from Amy, we just heard from Pascal, and even last year, my office, the Office of Inspector General, also did a related report where we looked at use of force, but in the context of first, how individuals come into contact with law enforcement, which a lot of times is also through traffic stops. And so based on all of this data, Remel, where we're hearing about the disparate impact of traffic stops, I want to know from you, is this new or surprising information about the frequency, concentration, and outcomes of traffic stops?
Thank you for that question. The reality is that this, information is not at all surprising. And we see it often on a daily basis when it comes to people in the community being pulled over by the police. I have personally been pulled over more times than I would truly like to admit. And as the data pointed out earlier in the conversation, it ended up with me being providing the requested information and being sent on my way, without being cited for a ticketed violation. But the thing I want to really point out is that the trauma, of these traffic stops and the sort of instantaneous heart palpitations that occur are not easy to forget, similar to what Jose pointed out with the physiology aspect of what happens to you. And truly, there has to be a better way that does not, include traumatizing and essentially, harassing people, which the data shows is not yielding the results to truly, solve any crimes or any issues. So yeah, it unfortunately is not surprising, but I do truly want to highlight the significant impact that it is having on the individual and the larger community.
Thank you for that. So now, even though the data we've been told shows that there are low percentages as far as results are concerned from the number of traffic stops of folks who are actually receive citations and or arrested. And so I want to pivot to Sharone for this question. Being in your position, sometimes when a person is arrested after a traffic stop, they might be assigned an assisted public defender from your office. Can you tell us about any patterns or common elements of the traffic stop cases your office sees?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is actually a great interview by a journalist from CAN TV named Sylvia Snowden. She's got a show on called Political Forum, and she actually interviewed one of our assistant public defenders, Margaret Almanza, and she talks about the cases that she sees, her and her fellow attorneys sees. This interview actually followed op-ed she wrote with another one of our attorneys, Megan Tomlinson, on the Tribune. I think it ran on the 13th of July. She starts with talking about when she gets pulled over, that stop starts with license and registration. She is not a person, she's not a Black male. But she talks about when she observes these videos, and she sees countless videos, about 25% of our felony caseload are gun possession cases, where the gun possession was uncovered starting off with a traffic stop. Those stops typically start off with, do you have a gun in the car? Or do you have gun registration? Or when a person is asked for the license, the officer goes through it and looks for an FOID card. Because all of these stops are on body cam, and because police officers typically send us hours and hours of body cam based upon kind of single stops, we get to see all of these different stops, whether they resulted in an arrest of a person or not. And unfortunately, we're not just seeing this on video, similar to what you just heard. You know, we as community members experience that as well. In the 3 weeks preceding the killing of Tyree Nichols, I was pulled over 3 times. Each of those stops really began with, do you have a gun? What we also are seeing is that there are many arrests that are happening when an individual has a gun license, but they may have not secured the gun correctly, right? It may not be concealed as the law progresses. So you see people who have gotten their licenses and they've chosen and they've gotten arrested for some kind of technicality. I think what the other trend that we're seeing, and I'll conclude with this, is that we are seeing so many kind of both young people and actually older people who don't have a lot of interactions with the criminal legal system being kind of pulled into these stops and being pulled into the criminal legal system based upon stops and then based upon the uncovering of a gun when that individual actually has a license, but there's some type of technical violation. So you're seeing this really giant expansion of the criminal legal net through these stops and through possession of guns that may not have this specific registration necessary to be carried. That at least is the allegation.
So Sharone has just taken us into a different area as it relates to traffic stops in our conversation here. And Pascal, you also look at data, look at trends. And one of the focuses of your reporting includes CPD's use of traffic stops as a tactic to target gun possession. Does Sharone's comments about gun possession offenses resonate with you in the data you've looked at in your reporting?
Thank you. So absolutely. From the data that I've looked at, it seems very clear that the growth in traffic stops is a very clear attempt by Chicago police to boost their numbers and boost their activity, that they can report favorably that they've recovered so many guns. I mean, in the resignation that the outgoing mayor, Lori Lightfoot, posted for the resignation of the police superintendent, the first thing that they congratulated the police superintendent was on his record-breaking numbers of gun recoveries. But as the public defender said, many of these are non-violent. The overwhelming majority of these gun recoveries, in fact, are non-violent cases. It means that you have a gun, but you don't have a piece of paper that says you can have that gun legally. In many cases, you have one license to have a gun, so you have a license to have a gun in your home, but you don't have a license to, for example, take that gun in your car without having it locked away in a certain box. So you're being arrested on a regulatory issue for not having the right piece of paper or for storing your gun incorrectly. And so when we think, oh, they're arresting people for guns, Chicago has a huge gun problem, I think it's really easy to conflate and say, oh, they're arresting these people who are running around the street and shooting and stuff, but that's not necessarily true. I've talked to the prosecutor's office, and they've said fairly consistently that these numbers move pretty independently of each other. Arresting more people for having a gun without the right license doesn't necessarily mean that you're arresting people who are driving the city's crime issues. And overwhelmingly, the data from prosecutor's office shows that these are different groups of people entirely. And I think to show that you see so many people getting arrested after a traffic stop where they're very clearly trying to be in compliance with the law, right? They have one license, but they don't necessarily have the other. And so that means that the Chicago police, they're really digging their heels in on a strategy, even though it's exceptionally rare to find these weapons in the first place. So it's kind of a numbers game. They're pushing these numbers that aren't necessarily even related to public safety in the first place. And in order to have that high number of gun recoveries, they have to stop an exorbitant, just unreasonable number of drivers just to boost these numbers when, I mean, at the same time, Chicago police is the number of people Chicago police is arresting on actual violent crime, right? Shootings, assaults, murders. That rate has plateaued and even decreased. Meanwhile, the number of arrests for these gun possession cases has increased markedly, skyrocketed over recent years. And so I think it's just really important to scrutinize what are our law enforcement agencies doing, and is this actually connected to what they say that they're doing for us?
You know, I would like to add one more thing as we're seeing a trend, and really, I think there is this giant drive to search as many vehicles as possible, and the justifications for those searches, we're seeing a trend with that. I think it's important to note, talking about kind of the legality of these searches, and you know, often, like I said before, you need a justification to stop a vehicle, and then you need a further justification to search a vehicle. So we're often seeing on this video is police officers saying, "Oh, I smell cannabis," right? Or they write down in the police report that they smell cannabis. And as we get into the case, there's no cannabis recovered. You know, there's no charge for, you know, illegal possession of cannabis. What we see is that it seems as if officers are kind of constructing a justification and then hoping on the back end that that search uncovers something that would justify them, you know, being a bit creative with what happened preceding the search.
So it looks like between Sharone and Pascal, we've sort of, or not sort of, we have addressed the topic of stops, saying that the end goal is, you know, to get firearms and, you know, address the gun and violence issue in Chicago. Okay, so we've addressed that, but now, well, maybe we just want to make roadways safer, right? Maybe that's why we have traffic stops. And so with that in mind, I'd like to address this next question to Pascal. One of the, actually, Jose, I apologize. This question is for Jose. So Equiticity does a lot of work to address making the roadways both safe and racially equitable. And some might assume that some traffic stops are a critical part of keeping our roadways safer. Would you agree with that sentiment? Why or why not?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tobara. No, I wouldn't agree with that sentiment. And I think, you know, the research, you know, speaks for itself. And on top of that, the police department themselves, they say that they use traffic stops to respond to violent crime. So not necessarily for roadway safety or traffic safety or just traffic violence. And I have to just reiterate how ineffective this strategy is, where less than 4.5% of these stops result in citations, less than 1% result in contraband. So they're not finding anything. So the next piece is, when I think about roadway safety, I think about being able to walk safely. So having safe crosswalks, having a wide sidewalks and long crosswalks so that we could cross the street safely. When I think of roadway safety, I think of having protected bike lanes. When I think of roadway safety, I think of dedicated bus lanes so that people can get from point A to point B using the bus safely. When I think of roadway safety, I think of less traffic jams. I think of less vehicles on the road. When I think of roadway safety, I think about less traffic accidents. I don't think about getting pulled over, getting a ticket, or having a speeding camera as a way of making our streets safer. So this whole dynamic, to me, makes it seem like the CPD is not really out there, and is not, their mission is not to keep the roadway safety, as they say themselves. Their goal is to respond to violent crime, and as the data shows, it's an effective strategy, and we have to do something to change that strategy and shift to things that actually make our roadway safer, which leaves the police out of it.
Okay, thank you for that. So shifting gears again, almost back to where we started off when we were talking about firearms, and now we've just talked about roadway safety. I mean, the reality of it is, living in Chicago, that public safety is a concern for many, and we know that that is a top conversation right now in Chicago. And there are folks who believe that traffic stops are the way to respond to violent crimes, including being a primary mechanism for taking guns off the streets. And others have expressed that there are serious concerns with a hotspot approach to policing, where CPD concentrates stops in neighborhoods with higher crime rates in a way that ends up having a disparate impact on the people living in Black and Latin neighborhoods. In fact, last year, OIG's report on use of force found that Black people have been overwhelmingly disproportionately stopped by CPD. And this is regardless of the crime level in the districts in which they're stopped. So what that means is across all of the districts, except for 2 of the districts, to include districts that CPD does not classify as high crime areas, there's still a disparate impact as far as the number of stops conducted as it pertains to Blacks. And so with that being said, I'm actually going to direct this question in multiple parts to many of the panelists, but I'll just start with Sharone. The Public Defender's Office sees cases stemming from traffic stops if a driver or passenger has been arrested. And the data Amy told us about showed that contraband like guns or drugs is recovered in a small percentage of traffic stops. What's your assessment on whether traffic stops are having an impact on violent crime, or whether traffic stops are an effective policing strategy?
Yeah, so let's be clear, our communities have a harm problem, and the state has an interest in reducing the amount of harm that we have in our communities. But what I propose is that the way we are pursuing reducing this harm is both ineffective, and it actually harms the people in those communities. I think about a story that just came across my desk last week of a young man that we represent who was on the eve of his 21st birthday, and he lives in a community where he feels unsafe. He has a license for a firearm. He was pulled over. He was cited for not having a CCL. And because of that, he now faces a felony, and he's unable to take his test for the firefighter's exam, right? That he was going to take in 3 weeks, right? This significantly inhibits his ability to feed his family, right? And be a productive member of his community. And oftentimes when we're talking about public safety, we only talk about public safety in one way, right? Like reducing the amount of guns in our streets, which are important, but we don't talk about what the criminal legal system does, which is significantly harm that individual's ability to care for his or her family. That has a public safety impact. That person have a felony on their background affects our community's ability to be safe and thriving. So we know it's an ineffective use of resources. We know that these stops rarely produce guns. We know that there are impacts to the community in terms of their ability to trust police officers and feel safe around police officers. We know that these stops are wildly dangerous, that they're often the impetus to dangerous encounters. And we know that they've had very little impact on the supply or demand for guns, right? Oftentimes we hear these numbers, right? Oh, 10,000, 12,000 guns pulled off the street, but we never hear the denominator. And the reality of the situation is that there are so many guns in our communities, right? That just taking off a couple thousand isn't affecting the amount of guns that we actually have in our streets. So I would encourage that policymakers really look at how do we reduce the supply of guns down the line? And this idea that we're going to focus in on pulling guns one by one and then giving those individuals felony convictions that harms their ability to actually provide for their family, well, I would argue that's a really poor way of trying to secure public safety. Let's be clear. We have a public safety problem, but let's be clear about the effectiveness of our current solutions. And let's be clear that we really need to be looking at stopping the flow of guns, and the current strategy doesn't do that.
And in a similar vein as it relates to public safety, I'd like to address the next question to Remel. You're a lifelong leader and resident of the West Side of Chicago. And so I want to get your perspective on the impact of concentrated traffic stops on the West Side and predominantly Black and Latin communities. How does it impact public safety?
So, based on the data presented, there isn't a positive impact on safety in our communities, right? Based off of what we've been hearing, what we have is this feeling of not feeling safe from the actions of the few bad actors in our community, as well as those who we pay to serve and protect. And that's very problematic. You don't feel safe for all of these different reasons, which also include those who we pay, to protect us, which is very unfortunate. And what it really does, and what we hear a lot in the community, and what seems to be consistent through what we're saying on this panel, is that this notion of safety becomes a fallacy, for communities like Lawndale, like Garfield Park, like Austin, as well as any communities that are predominantly Black or Latinx that may be on the south ends of the city. So that impact is not a positive one. And again, as it's been echoed, we have to find a better way, because the results of the current strategy are not yielding the necessary results. And in order to get to safety, it has to include community and not involve harassing and traumatizing and consistently pulling over people.
Okay, I'm going to stay on the same topic because, public safety is at the forefront of Chicagoans' mind right now, but I'll stop myself at one more individual who I'm going to address a similar question to. This will be for Pascal. And so some might argue that traffic stops are not racially targeted, but instead they are simply focused on communities with higher levels of crime in an effort to actually keep those communities safer. Do you agree with that, or how would you respond?
Thank you for the question. So I think that's, to some degree that is true. I think in Chicago, we have this project of statistically, it's perfect collinearity. Due to Chicago's history of segregation and redlining, the areas with a lot of the city's problems are Black neighborhoods, they're Latino neighborhoods. You just don't necessarily have, and it's kind of structured, I think, into the design of the city, that a lot of our real troubles are geographic, and so crime is really confined to certain neighborhoods. The conditions that create crime, that create violence, are really confined to certain parts of the city. So the problem with that is that crime, the way that we construct crime, the way that police will think about crime is racialized. There's this idea of, where are the cops going to find the guns? They're going to find them in the Black neighborhoods. Is this kind of expectation, because if you look, that's where the crime is happening, that's where the shootings are happening. But I think it's really important to note that you find crime where you look for it. If you're not looking for anything in Lakeview, in Boys Town, in Lincoln Park, if you're not looking for anything, you're not going to find anything. And so there's this issue of, if we're only looking in the Black neighborhoods, if we're only doing the traffic stops in the Black neighborhoods, yeah, of course, that's where we're going to find everything, right? And so I think there's a second really serious problem here as well, which is that if you're using traffic stops to search for crimes that have nothing to do with traffic, doing these pretextual stops, then officers are going to be incentivized to selectively enforce the law. If the traffic stop's not about traffic safety, they're not going to enforce traffic stops in the place where it'll have the biggest impact on traffic safety. They're going to enforce the law only in the places where they think they'll find what they're really looking for. And so if the ulterior motive is gun crime, then that means you can break traffic laws in some places and get away with it. And in other places you can't get away with it. So some of the experts I've talked to have said, this kind of, if the incentive is to find something that's not about traffic stops, then you're not looking for a traffic violation. You're looking for a person who looks like they have violated some other kind of crime, which I think gets us into the issue of profiling and of only stopping somebody who looks like a bad person, that's not about what that person's doing. That's about what's inside of us and what we think a bad person looks like and what a good person looks like. Okay, and so the final thing, which Tobara, I think you mentioned already, kind of introducing this issue, is that, yes, there's a huge racial disparity in that, they're stopping a lot more Black drivers because they're stopping more drivers in Black neighborhoods because there's more crime in Black neighborhoods. But if you look at the data for, again, Lakeview, Lincoln Park, River North, Streeterville, those neighborhoods, some of them, less than 2% of the people who live there are Black, and yet 30 to 50% of the drivers who are getting stopped are Black. And so even in places where there really just aren't that many Black people living there, again, going back to histories of segregation and redlining and things, but even in neighborhoods where there's hardly any of us around, we're still the ones who are getting stopped by the police. And so it's very clearly both this spatial geographic way that crime happens in our city and the way that police are going to approach that crime in our city, but then there's undoubtedly, even when you kind of control for that and can take that into consideration, even in white neighborhoods, Black people are being stopped, Black drivers are being stopped by police disproportionately. And so it's kind of all of these things are true, and it's really scary that all of these things are true.
Can I jump in real quick on this question, because I think it's a really good one. I think we can put the discrimination or racism of the strategy around kind of using the traffic code to enforce safety. Let's put that to the side. I think the real discrimination, and quite frankly, the real racism, is really in the lack of creativity around solutions and the lack of critical evaluation of what we're doing, and our unwillingness to evaluate whether what we're doing right now is producing results that keep us safe, and our unwillingness to really look at something different, right? I think you can get a bunch of Black folks, quite frankly, to justify stopping a bunch of people who are young and see if they have guns, right? I think you can get folks to say that. But my problem really is, if we have decades of research or all this research to suggest that it's not solving the problem, right? Then why aren't we thinking about better ways to keep us safe? And I think the reality of the situation is we are taking a policy problem and offering a political solution, right? Because guns on the table, right, is something tangible, right, that our leaders can say, hey, we're trying, there are guns on the table. In reality, communities are still suffering through that violence, right? And they still are unsafe, but they'll be offering these solutions which sound good, but we have decades and decades of research to show that it's not going to produce the results they deserve. That's the racism. That's the racism, allowing for the situation to continue.
Thank you for that insight. I'm going to quickly wrap us up so that we can get to a couple of the questions from our audience. But in these last few minutes, I want to ask each of the panelists, with the foundation being laid by Amy regarding the current status of traffic stops in Chicago and their impact on individuals and communities, particularly Black and Brown communities. I'd like you all to provide brief final reflections on the current state of traffic stops in Chicago. And I'll start with Remel and go through each of the panelists.
Thank you. First, want to thank BPI and the Free to Move Coalition for this opportunity. And I look forward to continuing this conversation, as it is very necessary. And I agree with Attorney Sharone that we have to come up with solutions. And in my final thoughts, I just want to say that I don't know anyone that desires to live in a community where they feel unsafe. And contrary to the narrative that is often pushed, we also do not collectively, protect those that partake in violence that is prevalent in our communities. However, in order to create safer communities, traffic stops are not the way. We first need to understand the importance of establishing trust, because oftentimes it's like, oh, we're eroding trust. No, there is no trust. So we first need to understand how to establish trust, and consistently pulling over everyday residents for minor equipment violations that are not yielding to any significant citations or violations is really eroding that opportunity. And so I really want us to be very clear about that this is not the way. And there are those of us on this call, those of us who are listening in, who have solutions, and we all need to be at the table so that we can take it away from, as Sharone pointed out, political, but actual results.
Thank you. You just mentioned Sharone, so we'll go to him next.
I've talked too much. I made a commitment to keep my answers under 3 minutes. I think I've violated that multiple times. So I'm going to give some space to the other panelists to have some time to complete their thoughts.
Well, we definitely appreciate you not just giving up some additional time, but everything that all of your observations based off of your experience, both professionally and personally. So we'll transition to Jose now.
Thanks, Tobara. Yeah, a big thank you to BPI and the Free to Move folks for putting this together and all the work that it took to get this information out there. And also a shameless plug, if any of this resonated with any of the guests that came, please go to free2moveshy.org and check out a lot of this in more detail, and then also sign up, and then you'll be hearing from me if you have capacity to join the coalition and move forward this great work. But right now, just reflecting what's on my mind right now, like I'm sure for many of you, is the upcoming election and how starkly different each candidate is. So there is a real potential that this tactic is gonna increase, that we're gonna see a lot more folks getting pulled over, and that's worrisome. So like many of the panelists said, we need to get this information out there. We need to show folks exactly what the results of this strategy is and how ineffective it is, and then also propose solutions and what else can be done to reach the same goal of keeping our roads safe, keeping our streets safe, and making sure that folks can get from point A to point B in a timely manner and safe and efficiently. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but surely not least, we'll pivot to you, Pascal.
Thank you, Tobara. So I think everybody has already laid it out so nicely, but I think at the core of this issue, it's just kind of a question of what are we really willing to sacrifice for the safety, for our community safety when it comes to our civil and constitutional rights. Are we willing to put those on the line, especially as other folks on this panel have discussed? There's no guarantee or even any marginal suggestion that this is a strategy that does improve safety and makes communities safer. On the other hand, can police do their jobs if every person has a cousin, a friend, a sister, people that they know who have been harassed in this way? Everybody might know somebody who, things have gone left and it's been a really volatile encounter. Can police do their jobs if the community feels like this is not somebody who's here to help us, this is somebody who's here to harass us? And so I think everybody on this panel is going to continue, hopefully, scrutinizing this subject, because there's really so much going on and so many factors at play here. I personally am going to continue to report on this. So if you follow me on Twitter or follow Block Club Chicago, we're going to have another deep investigation coming out pretty soon that will hopefully shed some more light on really the mechanics and what's going on internally, because it's not just a department-wide strategy. There are mechanics happening within the organization and the power structure of Chicago Police that there's reasons why officers and district commanders and the police superintendent feel incentivized. There's a reason why they want to have these numbers to show that they're doing good things even if those good things have nothing to do with keeping our police safe, or keeping our city safe. So yeah, I for one will certainly continue to keep up with the great work of everybody else on this panel related to holding police under scrutiny for that.
Thank you so much. So we've just in ways scratched the surface as it relates to the problem of traffic stops in Chicago. We've heard, starting off in the beginning, data from Amy setting out the quantitative analysis conducted by BPI as it relates to traffic stops in Chicago. Hopefully you all have gained some insight, not only into the quantitative data, but also into the qualitative data as presented by our panelists. And so our goal is to help lay out the problem, and what we've heard from each of the panelists relates to that cost benefit analysis. Remel hit on the police community relations, which a goal is, she said, not to just not erode, but that it doesn't exist in her opinion, and it needs to be established. So when we look at the data and the effects on actual people doing that cost benefit analysis and figuring out some solutions, which I hear that BPI and Free to Move are setting out to do. So first, I want to thank BPI and Free to Move for having me as your moderator. I want to thank you all as an audience where we look at this issue as Chicagoans to address it together. And especially thanks to all of our panelists for helping us address this issue. And so I'm going to actually pivot. We have a few minutes into some of the questions presented by our audience members. First question is going to be directed to Sharone. It says that BPI's presentation described the increased prevalence of and racial disparities in consent searches during traffic stops. How do consent searches work in practice?
You know, the word consent is funny. It's doing a lot of work in that sentence. You know, there's this idea that somebody with a gun on their hip and the ability to put you in a metal cage, that they can ask you to search your vehicle, and somehow that search is just completely consensual. And the reality of the situation is that I believe that in some instances, really law enforcement takes advantage of that kind of that threat of physical dominance to secure a search that the Fourth Amendment would normally bar. So I think it actually happens quite often. Oftentimes people don't understand their rights. They think that they must consent to a search. And quite frankly, I don't blame them, given the situation. We see the things that have happened on the news, and we know that we have a history of teaching our children to stay safe in these incidents. I still remember the conversation my late father had with me. You know, as a high schooler, I was a debater, right? I cared a lot about my rights. And my dad said, listen, don't get out there and debate on the corner of 119th Street, your rights, with somebody with a gun. So yeah, listen, the fact of the matter is that these consensual searches have often played a big role in securing vehicle searches. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you for that. This next question is directed to anyone, but we didn't actually get into the number of, well, actually, I think Jose may have mentioned it, how there are traffic stop cameras. So we got the speeding cameras, we got the red light cameras. I'm sure we got this camera, that camera, right? So there's a bunch of technology going on. And so without getting into any opinions as to whether like the prevalence of technology is good or bad, but the question is, to what extent do license plate readers increase traffic stops?
You know, I'll be honest, we have not studied that issue here at the Public Defender's Office. We probably need to partner with our friends at ACLU. I know that they're on the line and they've been doing some great work around that work, but we haven't particularly looked at that issue.
Would anybody else like to comment on that, or that is a to be continued discussion?
Yeah, I think it will be a to be continued discussion. That's not something that I'm aware that we were looking into, but definitely curious and interested to see if there's any correlation where license plate readers are deployed and the amount of traffic stops.
Okay, we are going to, I think we can get through maybe one more question, maybe two. So the next question is, CPD has in some years reported data to IDOT and other years have not. Does anyone know why? Pascal, do you have any insight or thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm not sure exactly which gaps in the data this person is speaking to, but CPD is required by state law to report this data to the Illinois Department of Transportation. This is a requirement under a 2000 and I think the law was in 2003 or 2004, sponsored by then State Senator Barack Obama. And the idea was to get an idea, an understanding of how, how racial disparities work in all police agencies statewide, so that we can see what's happening and so that lawmakers and, public officials can really hold police departments accountable. They do, from what I've seen, pretty much every year, they do report some data. It is numbers, it is data. Whether it's complete data or not is another question. Whether or not officers are actually documenting every single traffic stop as required by law is another question, which I can give you the answer. The answer is no, they're not actually doing that. However, that 2003, 2004 law that required this reporting, it actually it's initially supposed to be a temporary study, and so it has to be renewed by state law. It was only made permanent fairly recently, and so now it no longer has to be. My understanding is that it's either been made permanent or there's an effort to make it permanent so that it's not a renewable study, and it will be just statutory. There is, however, a gap in foot stop or stop and frisk data, because the system that Chicago Police has used to record foot stops has shifted. So as Amy mentioned earlier during the presentation, there was a lawsuit by the American Civil Liberties Union that really scrutinized how Chicago Police does their foot stops, and that due to that lawsuit, Chicago Police had to change how they document foot stops, which resulted in them decreasing those numbers. And so now, ever since that lawsuit, Chicago Police has to make that data public. But prior to that, I believe there's no data prior to 2016 for how they document and make public foot stop data. But now, for recent years, that data should be made available annually.
Thank you. Okay, so I have one last question. We only have time for one more. What issues need to be evaluated to further the discussion on the impact of conducting traffic stops, the impact that it has on public safety? Where do we go from here?
I think I'll just add really quickly. I think we need to take a page out of places like Philly, where they have implemented legislation that makes these minor traffic stops a thing of the past, where there is less interaction with motorists and residents. As we see, it can escalate into things where it's because of your tail light and it wouldn't have resulted in any other sort of violation. So I would say we need to research where people are getting it right in terms of policy and less interaction when it comes to police traffic stops, so that we can focus and target our efforts to actually address things that the community really cares about and seeing change.
Can I just jump in on that? I think an issue here with how we think about whether do traffic stops make communities safer. You just think theoretically, like, what's the mechanics of how traffic stops could make the city safer? There's this concept of general deterrence. General deterrence is, you don't have to be the person who's a bad guy doesn't have to be arrested for the community to be safer. Just the fear that this person, whoever it may be, might encounter a police or might be, have a traffic stop or might be stopped and frisked. Just that fear is enough to make the community safer. And so the question, I think, is, should we have a policing strategy that relies on instilling fear into the hearts of every single person living in the community? Because that fear is not just going to happen on the person who is carrying a gun or who's involved in whatever kind of gangbanging or crime or whatever. Everybody has to be afraid. Everybody has to know people who have been stopped and harassed for no good reason, or else this deterrent strategy doesn't work. And so just the theory, how is this going to make us safer, is something that we really have to scrutinize. And if it's something that relies on, just at its core, something that is insidious, maybe we shouldn't be doing it at all.
Jose or Sharone, otherwise we're out of time.
Yeah, very quickly. One thing that comes to mind is in the process of, like, if I'm not mistaken, the process of collecting the data here in North Chicago wasn't that clean, or there were some things that we couldn't figure out. So I'm reminded of places like California, that they have the RIPA law, which is Racial and Identity Profiling Act, and that pretty much reforms how police officers collect data, what kind of data they're supposed to collect and report it. And that's something that we don't have here in Chicago or Illinois. So that'll be, I think, a solid next step in how the police collects data and what they're looking for.
Sharone.
No, I think that's right on target. I think being realistic as well about the extent of the criminal legal system is also really important. I often hear people talk about, if we just enforce the laws that we have, we actually arrest people for these laws, then we'll be fine. And I'm like, how does the public defender's office have all of these workload issues? How are our caseloads so large if nobody's being arrested, right? Lots of people are being arrested, right? We have to realize that we are actually far down the line when it comes to enforcement, and it's not really working as well as we'd like. So again, I think we talked about on the panel before, we really need to think about the awesome power the government has to do lots of things, right? Not only put people in jail, but disincentivize people to commit these type of acts, but also put people in a better position so they don't feel the need to actually carry a firearm. And there are ways that we can do that, ways that we can explore that outside of just issuing criminal penalties that make people poor, make people less employable, and actually put them in jails and prisons.
I want to thank our panelists again for this very insightful conversation regarding problems with traffic stops in Chicago. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Jones, who is staff attorney with BPI.
Thank you, Tobara, our moderator, and our panelists, Pascal, Sharone, Jose, and Remel, for this thoughtful and engaging conversation that really gave depth to the data that Amy presented. I think that we have some clear alignment that these stops are made for criminal investigation rather than traffic safety, that they're ineffective for the most part, and creating some real harms for Black and Latine communities around Chicago, but also that it's time to take some action. And if you're interested in taking action steps today, I would encourage you to join the Free to Move Coalition and BPI for the second part of this webinar series on March 21st, where we will be exploring the solutions communities around the country, including places mentioned today like Philadelphia and California, are developing and implementing to address traffic stops. You can register for our panel. The link is just in the chat there. It's called The Alternatives to the Current Traffic Safety System. You can also read our report, which was released today on the website, A New Vehicle for Stop and Frisk, the Scope, Impact, and Inequities of Traffic Stops in Chicago. And there are also accompanying fact sheets if you don't want to read the full report. It's a little bit long, but if you're interested, it's all there. And last, as Jose said, you can sign up to join the Free to Move Coalition and receive updates from our work. We really want to create some momentum around this issue. And if you're on this call, clearly you care about public safety and furthering safety for all of Chicagoans. So we really encourage you to join us in this work. And thank you all again for your time, everyone that was involved and everyone who sat and listened. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.